Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my video. This is the first video in a new series where we are analyzing the performance versus quality of the different settings in different games. Today we're taking a look at Ark Survival Evolved, where we take a look at different settings, how to compare in terms of FPS versus fidelity, and lastly I will show my own optimized settings that I like to use. Firstly, I'll go over the settings that I will not be comparing in this video. First of all, resolution, that should always be at what your monitor's resolution is. Windowed mode, leave that at full screen so you're sure that you're not missing out on any performance, especially in a game like Ark. Graphics quality, we're obviously gonna not be using that because we're gonna make a custom one. After we have compared every single settings, you'll be able to figure out which one will suit you the best. And resolution scale should always be all the way over here, because if you take it down, like all the way over to the right is 100%. So if you take it down, you're basically taking down your resolution, and you don't want that. That's gonna look awful. That's the last thing you want to do if you can't get enough FPS. But that's enough for these settings. I'm not gonna prepare the rest. I'm gonna be going over all except dynamic tessellation. For some reason it would not enable it for me. I'm not sure why. I tried a couple of times but it wouldn't work. But let's get right into the video. All of the testing is going to be done on my own PC, where I'm currently rocking an i7-8700K plus a 1080 Ti and 16GB of RAM. Okay ladies and gentlemen, let's get right into the video. First of all, I just have a short clip showing the difference in both FPS and fidelity when you have the game set to the lowest that you possibly can and to the highest that you possibly can within the settings of the game. As you can see, there's a huge difference in both the fidelity of the game, the way it looks, but also in the FPS. So we have a lot of headroom we can work with in terms of FPS, and also in terms of making the game, or making sure that the game still looks good enough that we still want to play it. So the first setting we're going to take a look at is world tile buffers. And what world tile buffers does is that it utilizes and puts more of the world into your VRAM, so the RAM on your graphics card. In my testing, as you can see, I couldn't see any difference in FPS, even in VRAM usage, which was a bit weird. Maybe it's just hard to test it, I'm not sure, maybe I did something wrong, but as far as I can tell, there was no difference in FPS or fidelity. But so what I would suggest is to leave it at Ultra if you have enough VRAM, and if you are lagging on VRAM, maybe put it down and see if that helps you. The next setting we're taking a look at is the view distance, so how far you can see how far different trees, stones and such will render in. As you can see, there is a big difference between low and medium in terms of how many of the trees render in on the hill. But from medium and to ultra, I can't see any difference. There might be a difference if you're flying a lot, like flying really high into the air, you might be able to see a difference, but in my testing I couldn't find anyone. So what I would recommend is probably to use medium, because you get a bit more FPS than ultra, but you also still have the same range, at least when you're just running around. Next up we have anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing helps make the picture look a lot better by removing that shimmering you can see we have on low currently, and helps by removing those jagged edges you'll get around different objects in the distance. That said, as you can see, there's not much difference in terms of FPS in Ark. It's pretty much the same between low and ultra, so this is more what you prefer, what you would like the game to look like. I would recommend just using ultra because there seems to be no difference, and that's the most pleasing image, but Ark doesn't have the best implementation of this setting. And next up we have post-processing. Post-processing helps make lighting in the game look a bit better, so it adjusts the quality of different post-processing effects. That could be high dynamic range lighting, guardrays, green space, ambient occlusion, which I kinda tried to replicate in this scenario, but it was hard to replicate because from my own experience, I've been playing a lot of Ark lately, it doesn't seem to affect your FPS whatsoever, which is the same thing we see here in the video, except for one scenario where I dumped a lot of eggs, and all the eggs had post-processing effects which actually overloaded and make my FPS drop. So you will only really notice a difference in certain scenarios where it really takes effect. So I would probably recommend just leaving it at medium and let it be, and maybe you can turn it down to low if you want to. Another thing to notice with post-processing is that if you turn it down to low, you will disable the rendering of your character when you go into your inventory. So you know in Ark, when you open your inventory, you have a character on the right. That will disable, he'll just be a black silhouette instead of rendering the character. So you could disable it if you want to remove some of the lag spikes you can sometimes get when you open up your inventory. And next up we have the shadows. The shadows in Ark is put into two different settings, the general shadows and the terrain shadows. What you're looking at currently is general shadows, where you can see there's a huge difference in FPS between low and ultra. However, in terms of fidelity, how it looks, there's not much difference between medium and ultra. So what I would choose would probably be to use medium, because you get more FPS than ultra, but you still keep some of the shadows because it can look a bit weird on low, because you can see you are missing a lot of the different shadows from the terrain. The other kind of shadow setting is the terrain shadows, which oddly enough, when you look at those, there's not much difference in terms of either FPS or fidelity. I'm not sure what they do. Like, you would think they would change the terrain shadows, but the general shadows seems to be doing that. So what I would recommend is go from the general shadows, you put them at medium, and put the terrain shadows at medium as well, just to have them both at the same setting. Then you should be all good and get a lot more FPS while still keeping some of that fidelity, still having some shadow, which is always nice to have to make the game look a bit more pretty. And next up we have the textures. So the textures is gonna change how detailed the different textures in the game are. So that can be the terrain, the different rocks, not trees, but different rocks. That can be the ground, or as you can see on this user around us here, it can be the textures around you. If you look at his face, it's much more sharp the higher up you go. Generally, it doesn't seem to make much difference after you go onto medium. Low looks pretty awful. I would probably recommend to use medium or higher. I myself would probably use ultra, just because it doesn't seem to be any different in FPS, and just to make sure that I have the highest fidelity. But if you have any FPS issues, or if you don't have enough VRAM, I would probably suggest turning it down to medium instead, because it is gonna affect your VRAM usage. Next up we have sky quality. Sky quality is controlled using a slider. So I have decided some presets, which is 0, 25, 50, 75 and 100. And as you can see, as we increase it, we suddenly get clouds, more and more clouds, and we also lose more and more FPS. But as you will always also notice is that once we go past 50, there's not much difference in the clouds, and you already have a lot of them comparatively to the lower settings. So what I would recommend is just staying at around 50. Or if you really need the FPS, just turn it completely off, because it is just clouds, it's just nice to have, it's not something you actually need to have. You'll only notice it when you're actually looking up into the sky. Next up we have the ground distance and ground density. The ground distance is how far away you will load in the grass on the ground. So if you put it at 0, just basically disabling it. I would recommend putting this at around 50, that's my personal preference, because you still get a long enough range where you won't notice any pop-ins when you're just running around, or either by yourself or on your dinos, and you still keep a lot of the FPS you would otherwise lose if you went all the way up to 100. After that, we'll take a look quickly at ground density. And ground density, unlike ground distance, doesn't change that much in terms of FPS. It changes, the setting basically changes how much grass is on the ground. And this I would probably recommend just putting up to 100, unless you really notice a difference in your gameplay. I would just leave it at 100, because then you're gonna have that together with the ground distance is gonna mean that you have the most foliage on the ground that you can while running around, without taxing your graphics card too much and without losing too many frames. Mesh quality changes the quality of the trees in the world. So as you can see, the tree right in front of me is fully textures, even though I have it at 0. But if you look at the trees on the far right, far left, and well, just all the trees out in the distance, you can see as we increase the mesh detail, so will the detail of these trees increase, and they will start to look a lot better. You might have to scroll backwards and forth to see it. It's kind of hard to see it, but if you try to focus on the tree to the direct left, you'll be able to see it. And since, as you also probably have noticed, there's no difference in FPS, I would just leave this as 100, especially because it looks so ugly without it. The next thing we're going to be taking a look at is high quality anisotropic filtering, where you can either have that toggled on or off. If you turn it off, it should, in theory, help with sharp edges when you're looking at it from an angle. However, from my testing, I couldn't really find any difference, and you do lose some FPS from turning it on. And since you can't see any difference, and you lose FPS from turning it on, I would just leave it off. Next up, we have screen space ambient occlusion. What screen space ambient occlusion does is that it tries to add some soft shadows to crevices, objects, and surfaces that are in close proximity to each other. So that could be the metal wall and the metal ceiling. And as you can see, you do get a bit more details in the shadows between the wall and the ceiling. It's a bit more dark, seems a bit more realistic. However, you do lose a lot of FPS from turning this on, and it's just it's nice to have, so I would just leave it off if you need the FPS, because you do gain a lot of FPS from having it turned off. Next up, we have distance field shadowing. Distance field shadowing enables shadows out in the distance, like on the island in front of me. So you can see it has a lot more details, a lot more shadows on the right when we have it turned on. However, you do also lose a lot of FPS from having it turned on, so I would just recommend leaving it off. Next up, we have high quality materials. High quality materials enables the use of higher quality shaders, which should increase the fidelity of reflections on metallic and other surfaces, which is what I'm trying to replicate with the fireplace inside this metallic house. But as you can see, or maybe can't see, there's not really that much of a difference in terms of the fidelity. At least not for mine. I can't really see the difference between the two. And even in FPS, it seems to be a bit on and off whether or not who is winning the, like who has the most FPS. So I would just leave it off just to be sure, because there might be some very specific scenarios where you lose a lot of FPS and you won't know why. So just leave it off. Next up, we have subsurface scattering. What subsurface scattering is supposed to do is make it so that light will shine through the skin. So that's why I have chosen to focus on my hands here in the game, to make it look more realistic when light is shining down upon your hands. But as you can see in the video, I can't really tell any difference between the two settings, whether you have it on or off. And the FPS say the same thing. The FPS is almost exactly the same at all times, so I would just leave it off since it doesn't seem to do any difference whatsoever. Next up, we have high quality VFX. High quality VFX is supposed to make smoke look a lot better. However, in these two examples, I can't see any difference between the two. And the FPS seems to be a bit all over the place. Sometimes it's better with it on, sometimes it's better with it off, so I would just leave it off, just to be sure. Next up, we have simple distance character movement. And what that option is supposed to do is to make different characters, different models out in the distance have a more simple way of moving around. So it should, in theory, not look as smooth compared to having it off. But as you can see in this clip, I can't see any difference, both in terms of FPS or in terms of the character movements of the different dinos out in the distance. I've also tried like flying around and see if I could notice any difference there, and I couldn't test the FPS because that was too unpredictable. But in terms of the quality, in terms of the character movement, it didn't seem to be any difference between the two. So I'll just leave it on just to be sure. Maybe it will help you every once in a while if you have a lot of dinos, it might help. But otherwise, just leave it on. Next up, we have high quality LODs. High quality LODs is supposed to improve the level of detail of distant objects, surfaces, and other general game elements. So it's supposed to make different terrain and elements out in distance look a lot better. But as you can probably see from my video, I couldn't find any difference in either quality or FPS having this turned on. Maybe it's some special scenario where it's gonna improve the quality, but I couldn't find it. So I would recommend just leaving it off. Next up, we have extra level streaming distance. And as you can probably tell in the video, extra level streaming distance gives you an extra level of distance where you will load in terrain. And as you can see in the video here, it makes a huge difference in terms of loading in the trees in the middle of the screen. It can also make a huge difference in terms of the way you play the game. And since it only makes difference in terms of FPS of a couple of FPS, I would leave it on, because you can avoid a lot of pop-ins otherwise you're gonna get if you leave it off. It looks a lot better and it doesn't cost you that much. Next up, we have color grading, and color grading is more of a personal preference because all it does is change the way the colors look in the game. As you can see with it off and on, With it on, it gives a bit more of a vibrant color set, a bit more vibrant color set, but it's up to yourself. As you can see, it doesn't make any difference in FPS whatsoever, so play around with it and figure out which one you like the most. Next up, we have light bloom and light shaft. I have taken both of these settings and tested them at the same time because they more or less work together to create a more realistic image or more realistic lighting in the game. But it can be a bit aggressive in Ark, as you can probably tell from this short video. Especially if sometimes, the reason I personally turned it off is because sometimes when I was opening the map, I couldn't see anything on the map because the light was just blinding me. So I would recommend turning it off. If you really like it, you can leave it on. You do gain a few FPS by turning it off, but I also feel like you gain a lot of more playability because it is so sharp a light when you leave it on. And lastly but not least, we have low quality level streaming. And what low quality level streaming basically does is that it makes you load less of the world at a time. Which you can see in this video, makes us, when we have it off, we will load a lot further out. We will load the trees out in the distance, which we won't when we have it on. This can save us some memory, and this can also save us a few FPS. So I would probably leave this on if you don't have that much memory and want to save a bit on it, and just like, unless you really have a situation where you need it, I would just leave it on, because it's so far, you can see it's so far away before it actually stops loading in the textures and the different objects in the game. And that's it, that's the end of the video. Here at last you can see all of the options I have recommended put together into one picture, which you can just pause and use if you want to, or you can just adapt it to your PC setup. This is mostly adapted to my PC setups, which is probably different from yours. I've also included a clip here where you see me running around with these settings just to see what kind of FPS you will get. Of course, we're going to get a lot lower FPS when you're running around in all these structures we have built, because that's not really optimized by Ark, so you do lose a lot of FPS there. But once we go away from the buildings, we go out into the wild, we start getting up to the 90s, the 100s, staying around the 100s when we're just running around, fighting, doing whatever we want to. And I really like these settings because I feel like they're really a good balance between fidelity and FPS. I hope you guys liked the video. That's all I had. If you liked and learned something new, please like and subscribe for future videos where I'll take a look at other games and try to come up with the best settings where you match FPS versus fidelity. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye bye.